Hi, so this is our third lecture in the lecture series of object-oriented programming in Python. So today we are going to discuss a new topic by the name of operator overloading. So here we are going to discuss how to use different operators for multiple purposes. And we are going to discuss this concept in the context of classes. So let's first start with some built-in objects. For example, let's talk about string. So string is a built-in class in Python. So class is a kind of data type. So for example, if I define x is equal to IBA and then I define a new string y is equal to lumps. So now if I want to add these two objects, remember I told you before that this x is an object of string type, because when you write something like this, that means you're initiating an object of string type. So x is an object of string or an instance of string. Similarly, y is an object of string or an instance of string. So now if we try to add x and y with this plus operator, now I'll show you that how this plus operator can be used in multiple ways. It is going to serve multiple purposes for us. So when I add these two strings, I get IBA lumps. So the plus operator here concatenates two strings. So this is the purpose of plus when it is used for two string objects. So x is a string, y is a string, and when we use plus for these two objects to add them, this is the answer. Now let's try to use this plus operator for some integer. So when I say x is equal to 2 and y is equal to 3, so the sum of x plus y is 5. So when plus is used for integers, the answer is sum of those integers. So this is how plus works for integers. So in the previous case, these x and y, they were from the class of string and they are object of strings. And in this case, now these x and y, they belong to class of integers. So when you use different classes, objects or instance of different classes, then the meaning of s is different for different classes. So for example, let's try one more example. If I have a list, let's call it L1. First list is 1, 2, 3, and let's define another list L2, 2, 3, 4. So when you add these two lists, you get another list, and it's simply the combination of the two lists. So you see that the plus operator is behaving differently for different objects. So it depends on the class to which the object belongs. So the definition of this plus depends on the object and their data type. So here the data type was string, so we got this answer. Here the data type is integer, so you got this answer. Here the data type is list, so you got this answer. So now we are going to discuss that if we define our own classes and they have their own objects, what plus is going to mean for us when we use different objects from our classes. As we have discussed before, that for every class we have number of methods, and these methods do different things for the object of those classes. So let's check what are the methods available for string. In order to see that what are the methods available for a given data type, we can use this command dir. Dir simply means directory. So if I want to see what are the objects, what are the methods available, what are the attributes in string, I can simply say this dir of string. So this is going to give me a list of all the methods available for string. So there are, like, you see the different kinds of methods. We have talked about some of these methods. For example, this capitalize method is going to capitalize the string, and then this replace is going to replace a letter with some other letter, and strip is going to strip the spaces, trailing and leading spaces. So these all methods have their own jobs. So but we see there is these some special methods which start from double underscore and end with double underscore. So these are special methods, and we have already discussed one of these methods. We have talked about this method. So usually every class consists of this method, and the purpose of this method is to initiate instances of the class or construct object from the class. So but now we are going to talk about some of these other methods which start with the double underscore and end with double underscore. So we can define these methods for our classes that we construct. These are called magic methods. So for example, there is a method add. So let's see what is the purpose of this method. So this method add is going to define the purpose of this sum. So this add has been defined differently for different classes. This add has defined differently for the strings. When your class is string, this is what we have in add. We have told add to just print two strings together when this operator is called, and similarly we have told that method add to simply add the integers when plus is used for integer, and similarly we have defined add for the lists. If we have two objects which are from the class of list, then plus is going to act like this. This is what we have defined in this function add. Similarly, if we want to know what is the use of plus for our objects, for objects from our classes that we construct, then we have to define this add for our classes. So there are a number of ways you can use add. For example, this add is, if I have two integers, I can simply say I want to add them. I can say 2 plus 3, or I can use that add function for integers. So add function is going to take two inputs. First of all, you have to start with the class. So this add function belongs to class dot, and then this method starts with double underscore and add, and then it ends with double underscore. Now it takes two inputs, two arguments, so 2 comma 3. So this is going to give me an answer. 2 plus 3 is equal to 5. Okay, so I have made mistake here because I'm using this for integer, not for string. So I simply have to replace this class here. So class is int. So you see the answer is 5. So if you have this add method in your class, you can simply use plus to add two objects of that class. For example, I just give you an example. If you have an object of some class, and you have another object x from the same class, and if you want to add these two objects, you have to have this add method in your class, and you have some definition of this plus, that how we are going to add the two objects. Like here we have different definitions of add for string, list, and integer. So you have to define this definition, otherwise this plus doesn't make any sense, because these are objects, they have different attributes, they have different methods, so you have to define their sum in some sense. So this is what we are going to discuss in today's lecture. So now you can see that this plus has been overloaded, because plus has multiple meanings. It all depends on for what kind of objects we are using this plus. So this is called operator overloading, and we can use this for all kind of operators, plus, minus, division, and there are many other things. For example, here you see that you have add, class, contains, doc, dir, format. So length, you can use this length method for string. If your x is a string, then length simply gives you the number of characters you have. Let's say you have 2 characters, then length of x is equal to 2. Similarly, you can use this length function for objects from the class list. So we can also define this length function for our object. So the function length should make some kind of sense when we define it for our object. Okay, now let's define a simple class, and then let's see how this concept of operator overloading works with some generic classes. So I'm going to define a class which has only 2 attributes. So let's call it example, and then so the first thing in class has to be function, and this is called constructor function, and this is going to initiate the objects of these classes. So the first argument is always self. Let's only have 2 arguments, name and age. So let's make them attributes for this class. So self dot name is equal to name, and self dot age is equal to age. So this is our simple class. Let's save it and run it. Define 2 objects of this class and try to add them, and let's see what happens. So if I say x is equal to example, and let's initialize this object with name. So name is a, let's make it simple, and the number is 2. And then define, there's an error here. This a was missing, so example. Okay, now let's define another object y, and y is going to have some attributes. So let's make it b, and this is 3. So now we have these 2 objects and defined from the same class. So the object has these attributes, x dot name is going to give you a. Similarly, y dot age is going to give you 3. So what is the meaning of x plus y? It doesn't make any sense, because when you add these two objects, what is going to happen here? They are not simple integer, they are not simple strings, they are objects which have two attributes, name and age. So if you want to add them in some sense, you have to define that sense here. You have to define how do you want to add them. Simply x plus y is not going to work here. You see that it says that the plus operator is not supported. So x plus y does not make any sense. If you want to use the plus operator here, you have to use add function here, like we have used here, like we have discussed here. You have to define add function here. If you define add function here, then you should be able to use plus between the objects of the same class. So we have to define this. Similarly, x minus y doesn't make any sense. X minus y and x into y does not make any sense. Similarly, the print y. The print y also does not make any sense. What we are going to print here? Y is simply an object which has two attributes. So like y dot age and y dot name, we can just have their values. Like we can say that y dot name and y dot age. So we can get these values, but the print y does not make any sense here. So we have to have we need to define here that how we are going to print the object of a class. For that there's a special method. Like I told you, these are magic methods you can define for any class. So for the printing purpose, either we use this method representation, or we use this string method. So these two methods are going to define how your object is going to be printed. Okay, so let's get started with just this string method or representation method. So first we need to define how we want our object to be printed. So you can define the way you want, but it should make some sense. So let's define this method here. So def, and the method is rep. What is the spelling here? It's repr. So this method is going to take only one input. That input is going to be self. Why this method is going to have only one input? Because we are going to use this method to print your object. If you have to print, this is how. So this y is going to go here. Like we have this x object which is defined like this. So now if I want to print this x here, then x is going to go here. So that's why it has only one object. So the point is, when your class has this representation function or string function, then print function is going to work on your object. And if you have add function here, then plus is going to work for your object. Similarly, if you have subtraction function here, then the minus is going to work for your objects, right? So let's define first this function. So now let's decide how we want to print our object. You can print any way you want. So for example, I can say that my object should be printed in a way that the first thing should be the name, and the second thing should be the age attribute of that object. So I can simply say that. So I can simply define here a string. I can simply define here a string. Let's call it str. So this is just a name. You can have any name here. So whenever you use this representation function, or you use string function to define the way you want your object to be printed, you have to make sure that this has to be a string in a string form. So this function should return something which is a string. So I can define string like this using format function. So format, here my first argument is name. So self dot name comma self dot age. The first thing I'm going to have is name. So remember how we use this format function. So this first argument is going to go here where you have 0, and let's give some space, and then we can print the second argument. So there has to be comma here, So this self dot age is going to go here. So let me put just 1 here. No other formatting, just 0 and 1. Okay. So now we are going to have return statement, and we are going to return this string. So now this function is going to return a string, and that string is simply a representation of our object. So this is how we want our object to be printed. That first thing, the first attribute of the object should come first, and there has to be some space. Then we want to print the second object here. So this definition, this function is going to determine how our object is printed. You may use str here, or you can use representation. Both are going to work almost the same way. Now let's save it, and now let's run this and try to print our object. So let's define an object. X is equal to, so this is our object, example a comma 2. Since I have this representation function, I can use print function here. So print is going print of x. So when I use print, I'm going to get this representation the way we have defined here. So this is how your object is going to be printed. So a has come here and 2 has come here. You can define here any way you want. This is all your choice. So this is one way to print your object or display output of your object. You can also use this function here. You don't have to use print, but it's easy to use print, and this print is only going to work for your object if your class, this class has this representation method, and there's something we have defined here, how we want this to be printed. You can also use this method directly to print your object. So we can use this x. So this x is an object of this class, and this class has this method representation. So you can use this method to print your objects. You see that you get a2, a space 2. As I told you in my first lecture, how in number of ways you can use method of a class. So there are other way to use it. You can just use the name of the class, example dot. This class has this method representation. Start with double underscores representation, and now you can pass here this object x. If you're using a method which is preceded by a class name, then you can pass object as an argument to this method. That's why we have self here. The self always refers to object that we have created from this class. Okay, again you get a2. So if you have this function in your class, there are a number of ways to print your object output. You can either use the print of x. This is the most simplest way, and we usually do this for all built-in classes like string, list. We simply use print function, or you may use any of these two methods. Okay, now let's define how we want our object to be added, how we want the plus operator to be used for our object. So for that you have to use this add function, and our add function is going to take two inputs. One is going to be self, the object, and the other argument of this function will also be some kind of object of the same class, because you can only add object of the same class. So self, so let's define another argument, we will call it other. So both are going to be object of the same class, example. Okay, let's first discuss our strategy, how we want to add the two objects. For example, x is, let's say x is one object and y is the other object. So this x has two attributes, name and age. Y has two attributes, name and age. If you want to add these two objects, then how you would like to do that? This is our choice. So I can simply say that I will simply print a and b together, and I will add 2 with 3. This is my strategy. You can define this sum any way you want. There is no problem at all. So let's define here. So when you add two objects of the same class, their sum has to be object of the same class. For example, if you add two strings, let's say you have s1 one string, this string, and let's say you have another string s2 is equal to another string. So when you add these two strings s1 plus s2, you get another string. Let's call it s, and you may check the data type of this sum. The type of s is str. So the sum of these two objects is also have the same data type. So we have to make sure that here when we are adding these two objects, self and other, their sum has to have the same data type, as their sum should also belong to the same class. So to make sure that what we are going to say that okay, the sum, this is just a variable, has to be from the same class. So now we are defining an object of the same class, example class, and the answer is sum. So this is what we are going to return. Now here we have to define our sums. So because if the sum belongs to this example class, this sum is going to have two attributes. It's going to have one attribute name and the other attribute age. So we have to pass these two attributes here. So how we are going to do here, we are simply going to sum the name of these two arguments and these two objects, and we are going to sum the age of these two objects. So let's do that. So self dot name plus, now I have this object other. So there is no difference between self and other, both are objects. So other dot name. So we have added the two names. For example, here this A and B. Let's say if these are your objects, we have added A and B, and A and B are strings. When you add them, you get them concatenated, comma. So now we are going to add their age. So self dot age plus other dot age. So this is how we have defined some of the two objects of the class example, and we are going to return this sum here. Now whenever you use this add function to add two objects, this is you are going to get an object of the same class. So in a way that the first argument is the name of the two objects, sum of the name of the two objects, and the second argument is sum of the ages of the two objects. Now let's try to use it in the interactive window. So Control S, save it and run it. So this was your first object, and we define another object. Now you can use this plus x plus y between these two objects, because we have defined this add function in this class example. So this allows you to use this plus operator between the objects of the class example. So when you run this, you see A, B, 5. So A and B come together, and then sum of 2, 3, which is 5. So you can use the plus operator, or you may use the function here, like we did for this representation function. So what I can do is I can say that the example class has this method add, and this add takes two inputs, and let's pass x comma y. So you'll get the same answer, a b comma 5. Either you can use add or you can simply use plus, but it's better to use plus. So now you see that we have overloaded this plus operator. It has different meaning for different classes. It has different meaning for list, it has different meaning for integer, it has different meaning for strings, and it has different meaning for the class that you have constructed. Similarly, you can define subtraction, multiplication, and division. So for subtraction, let's do it quickly. So let's define a method def, and for subtraction we use sub. There has to be space here, and then again you can have this self and other. So this is your choice to how you define the subtraction of the two objects. Let's define it in the similar way. We copy it and paste it here. I'll just call it sub. This is just a name you can use any name here. And then here I just want to make some changes here. So I'll just leave plus here, because this self dot name and other dot name, they are strings. We cannot use minus operator between the strings. So I will use this as it is. I will only use minus here. This is my definition of the difference of the two objects from this class. You can define any way you want. There's no problem at all. So now let's save it and run it and then try to use it here. So let's define y object, then x object again. Now we can use x minus y. So when you use x minus y, you get this. So we didn't make any change here. That's why you get AB here. And we have used minus here. So we get 2 minus 3. So the answer is minus 1. So this is our definition for this class. Okay, let's define a function for multiplication. So def for multiplication we use mul, and similarly it's going to take two inputs, self and other. So again you have to make sure that the multiplication of the two objects from the class example, their product has to be object of this from the same class. Like here the subtraction is an object of the same class and sum is an object of the same class. Similarly we have to make sure that this product has to be from the same class. So now I'm going to define here, let's call it multiplication. So it has to be object of the same class. That means we have to have this class name here. Now here we have to define what should be the first argument and what should be the second argument. It's up to you what you want to define here. Let's just do this way, that we multiply this b with 2. We do the cross multiplication. We multiply this b string with 2 and we multiply this 3 with string a. So remember what happens when we multiply a string with an integer. For example, if you multiply this a with 3, then a is going to be printed 3 times, and similarly if you multiply this b with 2, it's going to be printed 2 times. So this is just my choice to multiply the two. So let's define here. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to multiply the self.name with the self other dot age. So the first name of the first object is going to be multiplied by the age of the second object, comma. This is going to be first argument for this function, and then we multiply self dot age of the first argument with name of the other argument, other dot name. So this is our definition, and now let's return this value, multiplication. Now let's try to use it and see how it works here. Save it and then define an object x is equal to a comma 2, the same object, and then we define y b comma 3, second object. So when your class has this multiplication function, you are allowed to use the static sign between the two objects of the same class. So x static y. So x static y is a b, because we multiplied this a with 3, so a has to be printed 3 times, and we multiplied b with 2, so we got b 2 times. So these all methods are called magic methods. So any method that starts with double underscore and ends with double underscore is known as magic methods, and they are used for operator overloading. So now let's define another method that is called length, and for that we use len. The length is going to take only one argument, self, the object of this class. We have used length before for many kind of objects, like I have used it here, length of some string. Let's say this is your string, so it's going to give me the number of characters this string has, and similarly length of list is going to be the number of items in a list. But what would be the length of an object? For example, what would be the length of this object x? So as such, the length makes no sense here, because this object has two attributes, a and a name and age. How we are going to define an object here? So maybe we can say that the length of an object is the number of attribute it has. That is one sensible way you can define your length, or you can simply define length of one object is just 1. This is another way to define it, and you can define any way you want. Now let's define it here. So in this case, I'm going to define length of an object to be equal to the number of attributes it has. In this class, every object of this class is going to have only two attributes, because this is what we have defined here. So I will simply say that this returns, I don't need to do any kind of calculation here. I can say return 2. So this is going to return 2 all the time. When you use this length function for this object, it's going to return 2. Okay, now let's try to use it here. When you run this and you define an object x, now you should be able to use this length function for this object. So the answer is 2. Or you can use the other way. For example, you start with the function class name, and then you use full name of this method, and then you apply this on x, so you get 2. So length of the object is 2. This is what we have defined here. So there are many more functions, many more magic function. You can define the way you want, and we are not interested in most of these functions here. I just wanted to make sure that you know what these magic functions are and how we can use them. So one of the uses of these magic functions is to be able to use your objects like built-in objects. For example, I can use, for string I can use plus, minus, static. For integer I can use plus, minus, static. Similarly for list I can use these operators. So I want to use those operators for the class that I have constructed. So I want to use my own class like the built-in class. That's why we use these magic functions to overload operators. Let's do just one more example and construct a new class. So in this class, what we want is we want to construct a class, and the object of the class are going to be vectors. We want to define this add function for vector. What is the meaning of adding two vectors? For example, if you have list, when you add two lists, actually you get two lists combined together. So this is how the plus works for lists. So L1, if I have L1 and L2 is equal to 2, 3, 4. When I add these two lists, L1 plus L2, I get this. So first list comes first, and then second list get second position. But what if I want something like this, that addition means the entry by entry addition, that 1 should be added to 2, 2 should be added to 3, and 3 should be added to 4. This is how vector addition works, but this is not true for the list. So for that you can define your own class. Let's define it here. So I'm going to define a class by the name of vector def initiate, and this is going to have first argument should be self, and the second argument is vector. So okay, let's make this vector as the attribute of this class. So vector is equal to vector. Now let's define a function here, def add, for this class, and this add is going to take two inputs, self and other. So now when you have two vectors, so we want to define their sum as entry by entry addition. Like I have explained here, that vector addition works like that every corresponding entries are added. So that's what we are going to define here. Okay, let's define this here. The sum of the two vectors are going to be a vector, so we need to have an empty list to store that vector. So I would just call that add is equal to empty list. So I'm going to store, like, let's say 1 plus 2 is equal to 3 in this list, and then 2 plus 3 is equal to 4, the second entry in this list. So this is what I'm going to do here. And now let's define the sum. For sum we need to use for loop, and for loop is going to range over the length of this vector. So I can say that I in range length of this vector, and to use this vector you have to use self dot vector. And now we are going to add here, we are going to perform an entry by entry addition. So in this add we are going to append some of the entries of self and other. So self dot vector, this is going to be your first argument. So let's take the ith entry and add that ith entry in the ith entry of this second argument, second list. So other dot vector. So remember, the other is another object and self is the first object. So we are adding the two objects, and both objects should have the attribute vector. That's why we are using vector for other, vector I. Okay, now I'm going to define an object. Remember, as I told you before, when you're adding two objects of the same type, the answer has to be the object of the same type. So we have added these entries of these two objects in this add empty list. Now after for loop is done, this add is going to have some of these two vectors. So now let's define an object of the same type, and the type of the class is, name of the class is vector. So we have to make sure that the sum that we are getting here is an object of this class. So what I will do here, I'll just define sum is equal to example, vector, and vector is going to have this add here. So remember, this constructor function takes only one input, and that has to be a vector. That's why we have defined an object of this vector class by using this statement. So this is what we are going to return from this function, return sum. So now how this add function is going to work for this object, this class. Whenever you use this add function to add two vectors, it's going to add corresponding entries of that vector. So let's see how this works. Okay, before that, we just want to define how we want object of this vector to be printed. So again, for that we use representation function, and it's going to take only one input, and the return statement, whatever this function is going to return, has to be in the form of string. So self is going to be a vector, and we just want to print that vector. So I will just say return self dot vector, and I should make sure that this is in the form of string, so I can just convert its type using string. So now this vector class has three methods, and all of these three methods are magic methods. So the first method is going to construct object that is going to have these attributes. So we have just only one attribute now, and the add function is going to determine how you want to add two vectors that belong to this class. The last function is going to determine how we want to print any object of this class. Now let's try it here. Let's save it and run it. And now let me define an object of this class. So let me define vector vec is going to be object of this class, and the class is, name of class is vector. Here I can have any kind of list here. So I can say 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you run it, you have actually defined this object. So when you define an object like this function runs automatically to initiate or to initialize an object to the class. Now you can check that vec has only one attribute, and that attribute is just this list. So vector is going to give you this list. If you want to use print function for this vector, this object, let's see how it works. Print of vec. So this simply going to print this list, because this is what we have defined here. Now let's take two objects of this class and use plus operator to define this sum. So I am going to define one object of this class vec1. Let's define another object of this class, and let's change these values 3, 4, 5 and 6. Now let's use plus to add these two objects to get a new object, and new object is, let's call it VEC. So this is your new object. You can print this object and see what is inside. So object vector is simply the sum of the two objects, or sum of these two vectors, and sum is calculated by adding the corresponding entries. 1 plus 3, 2 plus 4, 3 plus 5 and 4 plus 6. This is the required sum. So these are a few magic methods that we have discussed in today's class. So I don't think we need to discuss more of these methods. So this was just an introduction to operator overloading. So in the next lecture, I'm going to solve some problem which are going to use the concept we have discussed so far. Thank you.